Okay, thanks very much for coming, everyone. As you all know, we're delighted to have Professor Oded Galor delivering a lecture on his new book, The Journey of Humanity. Oded is the Herbert Goldberger Professor of Economics at Brown University, and he's visiting GPI until the end of June, so if you're about in the building, feel free to try and chat to him in that time. His research spans a number of subfields in economics, including growth, long-run development, economic history, and evolutionary economics, and he's best known for developing and founding unified growth theory. He has numerous affiliations and has won many awards and accolades. We only have an hour scheduled, so I'm not going to go into them and I'm not going to list them here. So Oded will give a 45-minute lecture, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. So please save your questions to the end. For those following online, you can submit questions using the online form, and I'll read them out at the end. But there's no option for you to kind of say the questions, so I'll just have to read them out. So do please be specific with the questions. But without further ado, let me hand over to Oded, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to discuss the book that I just released about 2 months ago. So broadly speaking, The Journey of Humanity, the book that I released, as I said, 2 months ago, is an attempt to explore the evolution of human societies since the emergence of anatomically modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. In particular, this is an attempt to resolve two of the most fundamental mysteries that surround this journey. What I will define as the mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of the dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 200 years after 300,000 years of stagnation? Or if you wish, why is it the case that in the past 200 years, living standard as measured by income per capita increased 14-fold, whereas over a 300,000 year period, arguably, there was no change in the standard of living? And the second mystery will be the mystery of inequality, namely, what is the origin of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations? Why some countries are rich and others are poor? And why is it the case that in the past 200 years, we see an enormous increase in the gap in the wealth of nations? Now, over most of human existence, as suggested by Hobbes, human life was largely nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, human life was remarkably similar to the life of any other species on planet Earth. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards were very close to the subsistence level, and there were minor differences in living standards across time and across space. Now, in fact, only about 3 or 4 centuries ago, 1/4 of newborn did not reach their first birthday, and nearly half of them did not reach their reproductive age. About 1/10 of women perished during childbirth. Life expectancy fluctuated in a very narrow range of 25 to 40 and rarely exceeded 40. And an economic crisis over this time period did not require belt-tightening, but led rather to mass starvation and ultimately extinction. But then something very dramatic occurred in the past 200 years, literally a metamorphosis. We see a dramatic transformation in living standards within and across societies. World income per capita increases by a factor of 14 over a 200-year period after literally 300,000 years of stagnation. Life expectancy has more than doubled. And, as I said earlier, a great divergence took place in income per capita across the globe. Now, to illustrate this metamorphosis, consider for a moment residents of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, Roman Jerusalem, and whisk them in a time machine forward from Jerusalem in the Roman period to the time period of the beginning of the 19th century, namely Ottoman ruled Jerusalem. This 2,000-year jump in the context of this time machine nevertheless would lead into instantaneous adaptation. Past knowledge would be largely applicable. Technological improvements would be merely incremental and would permit rapid adaptation to the new environment. Occupations would require very similar skills, and life expectancy would remain the same, and as a result of it would not require any adaptation of the mindset of individuals potentially to future-oriented behavior. But now consider the same individuals and whisk them now in a time machine only 200 years forward, from Ottoman Jerusalem of the 19th century to contemporary Jerusalem. This will be a shocking experience, a devastating experience. Past knowledge would be largely obsolete. Modern technologies would appear to these individuals as witchcraft. Occupations would require incomprehensible skills, and life expectancy would instantly double and would require a future-oriented mindset, a mindset that permits education decisions, saving decisions, life cycle decisions. So something very dramatic occurred in the world economy in the past 200 years that did not occur over 300,000 years earlier. Now, in contrast to some conventional wisdom that exists in some circles that are primarily based on misinformation, living standards had not increased gradually in the course of human history, certainly not since the Neolithic Revolution. What we see in the course of human history is that technology is advancing gradually in the course of human history. But this technology is not resulting in greater economic prosperity. It has a negligible impact on living standards. Instead, it contributes to the size of the human population. And in fact, the recent rise in the standard of living reflects what I will define as a phase transition, namely an abrupt transformation once a critical tipping point has been reached. Now, to understand this metamorphosis, consider for a moment the evolution of income per capita in the past 2,000 years. As you can see here, from the year 1 till the middle of the 18th century, income per capita is very close to the subsistence level. The fluctuations around this subsistence level, but largely there are very minor deviations. And then suddenly we see something very dramatic that occurs in the past 200 years. An enormous increase in the standard of living. As I said, a 14-fold increase in the standard of living within a 200-year period. In fact, if I would be able to erase the labels from the x-axis and the y-axis here, and I would show this graph to a random scientist, most people will view this graph as a reflection of tectonic activities. These are not tectonic activities. The eruption that we see here is the eruption in income per capita. Income per capita is relatively stable over a long period of time, and then we see this enormous eruption. We can argue whether, in fact, some growth occurs in the 17th century, in the 18th century. This is negligible. Where the change is really dramatic is in the past 200 years. But in addition, something that equally dramatic occurred over this time period. Not all societies are taking off at the same time period. Some societies are taking off earlier than others. Western European nations and their offshoots in North America are taking off first. Others are lagging behind for a prolonged period of time. And as a result of it, an enormous divergence is occurring in the world economy. Remember that the takeoff on average is associated with a 14-fold increase in income per capita. And this implies that if one country or one region of the world is lagging behind and another one is taking off 200 years earlier, an enormous gap is created in the wealth of nations. This is precisely what we see over this time period. If you look at the richest regions of the world in 1800 and compare them to the poorest one, the ratio in income per capita is about 3 to 1. And if you look at it today, the ratio can be 15 to 1, 20 to 1, even 100 to 1, depending how you define regions. So naturally, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality are intimately linked. And if we would like to understand the roots of inequality today, we have to focus on the distant past. We have to understand what are the forces that led into this differential timing of transition across the globe. Why is it the case that some societies took off at the beginning of the 19th century and others only towards the end of the 20th century, if at all? So the resolution of these two fundamental mysteries, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality, requires then the identification of the forces that permitted the transition from stagnation to growth across the globe. But in addition, it requires the identification of the origins of the differential timing of the transition across the globe. Why some societies are taking off much earlier than others. And ultimately, it requires the identification of what I will define as deep-rooted forces, historical forces and prehistorical forces that operated in the distant past and led into this differential takeoff across the globe. Now, naturally, if we will be able to resolve these mysteries, we'll be in a better position to design strategies that could mitigate inequality across the globe as a whole. Now, based on my argument that much of the inequality that we see across the globe today is originated in the differential timing of the transition that occurred 200 years ago, it is quite apparent that what would be required in order to resolve these mysteries is a unified theory of economic growth, a theory that will link the distant past and the present. Now, if you look at the process of development as a whole, the process of development as a whole can be divided into three fundamental phases: the Malthusian epoch, the post-Malthusian regime, and the modern growth regime. Now, the Malthusian epoch originates with the emergence of anatomically modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. And it lasts over 99.9% of human existence. And what is interesting about this period is the dualism that it reflects. On the one hand, stagnation in living standards, but on the other hand, certain dynamism in the context of technology, population, and human adaptation. And it is this dynamism that after 300,000 year period is leading into the beginning of economic growth in the course of the post-Malthusian regime. But when growth occurs initially, the Malthusian forces are still operating in the sense that much of the growth is counterbalanced by population growth. And it is only in the post-1870 period, in the context of the most advanced societies in the world, that we see the onset of the demographic transition and the emergence of modern economic growth. Now, interestingly enough, it is the Malthusian epoch that holds many of the secrets that are behind the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality. Namely, we would like to understand the roots of inequality today. We have to look at the distant past and the forces that operated during the Malthusian epoch and led into this divergence that occurred in the past 200 years. So as I said, the Malthusian epoch is characterized by this interesting dualism. On the one hand, stagnation, and on the other hand, dynamism. Stagnation in living standards. Income per capita fluctuates without a trend over a prolonged period of time, very close to the subsistence. Life expectancy fluctuates in a very narrow range between 25 to 40 over a prolonged period of time. So this is the notion of stagnation. But at the same time, during the Malthusian epoch, we see great dynamism that ultimately rescue humanity from the poverty trap that was associated with the Malthusian epoch. And this dynamism is in the context of technology, in the context of population, and in the context of human adaptation. So what we see over this time period, that at any point in time, technological progress is nearly negligible. Population growth is nearly negligible. human adaptation is nearly negligible. A 300,000-year period is an enormous period. And over this period, we move from stone tool technology to steam engine technology. We move from a population on planet Earth that is about 2.5 million in the eve of the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago to about 1 billion people in the midst of industrialization, 400-fold increase. And we see great adaptation of the human population to the technological environment and at the same time the geographical environment. And it is this Malthusian dynamism that ultimately rescue humanity from the poverty trap, the Malthusian trap, and permits the transition from stagnation to growth. So there are three critical elements in the Malthusian epoch that will be critical in understanding and resolving the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality. The first one is the impact of technology on the size of the population. So during the Malthusian epoch, technological progress naturally led into an increase in income per capita. But unlike today's world, in which this increase is relatively permanent, this was only a short-run effect. And why is it so? Because the increase in population growth, the increase in income per capita, generated a reduction in child mortality, generated an increase in fertility rate, and as a result of it, population grew, and the resources that were generated by technological progress were divided over a larger population. And consequently, income per capita inevitably reverted back to the previous equilibrium position. So when technology arrived, there was a spike in income per capita, but it was not long-lasting. Income per capita reverted back to the previous equilibrium position. Why is it so important? Because it implies that during the Malthusian epoch, technologically advanced societies or land-rich societies had higher population density but very similar level of income per capita. So unlike today's world, in which technologically advanced societies are more prosperous, in the past, technologically advanced societies like China were more populous, not more prosperous. And evidence are very striking about it. Look at the relationship between, say, land productivity and population density in the year 1500, for instance. You can see that places that are more productive have higher population density. But if you look at the relationship between land productivity and income per capita, there is no relationship. Namely, places that had higher land productivity had more people, but not richer people. And the same is true in terms of technology. In those societies where technology was more advanced, we see greater population density, but very similar level of income per capita. So that's one important element of the Malthusian epoch. When technology advanced, more people were supported, but not richer people. The second element that is important for the resolution of the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality is the impact of technological progress on human adaptation. So as I said, the Malthusian pressure affected the size of the human population. But at the same time, it affected the composition of the population. Survival was not random. Survival was based on adaptability to the technological environment. So traits that were complementary to the growth process generated tautologically higher income, and as a result of it, in the Malthusian world, higher reproductive success. And therefore, they became more prevalent in society. And this implies that human adaptation over this time period raised the prevalence of complementary traits to the technological environment and reinforced the process of development and ultimately the takeoff from stagnation to growth. This is the second key element, human adaptation, that is reinforcing the growth process. And the third element has to do with the origins of technological progress over this time period. During this time period, the size of the population and the composition of the population foster technological progress. Why is it so? Because larger population and larger number of potential innovators, and is the fact that the supply of innovation. And larger population generated larger demand for innovations, and again, this fostered technological adaptation. In addition, it generated greater diffusion of knowledge, permitted the division of labor and trade, and consequently affected the technological environment. So what we see in the course of human history is that there are certain wheels of change that are governing the process of development. And there are three of them. And during the Malthusian epoch, it is the size of the population and the composition of the population based on human adaptation that affects technological progress. And in turn, technological progress is governing the size of the population and the composition of the population. And these wheels of change are rotating gradually in the course of human history. We start with a modest population in Africa 300,000 years ago. This population is equipped with the human brain. They're able to develop new technologies. These technologies support more people support better technology, etc. Initially, the pace is very, very slow. We move from one stone technology to another stone tool technology over thousands of years. But the process becomes more and more rapid, and as I said earlier, in the course of this process, we see that the size of the human population increases more than 400-fold, even in the course of the past 12,000 years. Now, why is it so important? It is important because at a certain point, humanity reaches a tipping point, if you wish, in which technological progress is so rapid that in order to cope with the rapidly changing technological environment, individuals must start to invest in their education. So human capital becomes essential to permit individuals to cope with the rapidly changing technological environment. But how do you invest in human capital? Parents are quite poor, they cannot economize on their own consumption, and as a result of it, they are forced to reduce their fertility rate. So responsible parents are forward-looking, they understand that their children will operate in an environment in which human capital, education, broadly speaking, will be very important. They start to invest in education, but they cannot afford the same number of children, they reduce fertility rate. And why is it very important? Because this implies that the Malthusian equilibrium vanishes, namely the counterbalancing effects of population on the progress of technology is being eliminated. So the growth is freed from the counterbalancing effect of population, and the holy triangle, if you wish, technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth are all pushing the world into the sustained growth regime. So this can illustrate for you the theory that I just proposed, that, as I said, is based on quite profound mathematical theory that is known as unified growth theory that I advanced in the past 20 years or so. What you can see here quite clearly is that we start in Africa with a certain size of population. As I said, these people are equipped with the human brain and they're able to advance the technology. Technological advancement permits more people to be supported, but in addition, it changes the composition of the population due to human adaptation. And the wheels of change are rotating and reinforcing one another over a prolonged period of time, up to the point in which technological progress is rotating rapidly, very rapidly, okay? The importance of human capital is growing and growing and growing. It doesn't have an effect till we reach a tipping point. At this tipping point, we truly see a phase transition, a bifurcation point in which suddenly individuals are investing in human capital, the fertility starts to decline, and the world is gravitated towards the modern growth regime. Now, to understand it in a different way, think about the phase transition that perhaps is more familiar to you, which is the phase transition that we see in nature from liquid to gas. As we know, when we heat water, at a certain point, when the water temperature reaches 100 degrees, we see the transition, a phase transition from liquid to gas. Now, but in this process, we don't see this transition taking place for a long period of time. As the temperature are increasing and increasing and increasing, there is a tipping point that is associated with the phase transition. The same is true in the course of human history. Technological progress starts to increase very modestly initially, accelerates, and then it reaches a critical point. When it reaches this critical point, we see a phase transition. Literally a phase transition in the sense that we move from one equilibrium to another, and under the new equilibrium, in fact, investment in human capital is taking place, fertility starts to decline, the growth process is free from the counterbalancing effect of population, and the world is sailing into the modern growth regime. But very importantly, as you see in nature, not all water molecules are converted from water to gas at the same speed. Some of them are converting earlier than others. And the same is true in the world economy. Not all societies and not all regions are moving from the Malthusian epoch into the modern growth regime at the same time. And as a result of it, a huge divergence is taking place in the world economy. Now, so when we think about the march of humanity, it appears to a large extent that the march of humanity thus far has been unstoppable. If you think about shattering and dreadful events in the distant past, say the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, or World War I and World War II in the 20th century, the Great Depression, the Spanish flu, and most recently COVID-19, it appears that these events are devastating the population that are living through them, but ultimately they have limited impact on the grand arc of human development. Namely, the grand arc of human development is ultimately driven by these wheels of change that are operating relentlessly. They can slow down for a moment due to a potential crisis, but in the end, the drivers of human history are unstoppable up to this point in time. And beyond that, look at the Black Death, for instance. It appears that living standards are recovering quite swiftly from each of these catastrophes, and in some sense, humanity is recovering from these dreadful events with greater strength and greater resolve. But the question is whether climate change, in fact, will be the most important and the most devastating catastrophe of all that will ultimately derail humanity from its long-run march. And here, the journey of humanity is providing some hopeful outlook. And the hopeful outlook is not based on a naivete about the world. Naturally, climate change is quite of a challenge, but nevertheless, the hope is coming from the following observations. If you think about climate change, it is originated by technological acceleration that is bringing about steam engine technology, industrialization, industrial pollution, and climate change. But this technological acceleration, as I argue momentarily, is associated with additional forces. It is associated with human capital formation. Society is much more educated, and as a result of it can understand the looming catastrophe that is associated with climate change and perhaps reform behaviors accordingly. But perhaps most importantly, it is associated with the power of innovations. And we saw this power of innovations in the context of COVID-19. If COVID-19 would have affected humanity 200 years ago, perhaps COVID-19 would have lasted 4 decades and would have devastated humanity to an enormous extent. But here, the ingenuity of humanity is permitting us to develop mRNA technologies within a year and to a large extent allow us to sit in this room maskless except for one individual and enjoy the benefits of modern technologies. So again, we developed the power of innovations, and we saw in the past that human ingenuity is such that, in fact, it will come to a rescue when it will be needed. Now, in addition, what we see during this time period is the persistent decline in fertility. As you know, even India reduced fertility rate just below replacement level a few months ago. And this implies that the number of polluting individuals will decline gradually. This implies that, in fact, the burden on the environment will decline temporarily, and this mitigation of the current trend of climate change will buy scientists 3 or 4 decades to develop revolutionary technologies that perhaps will turn this climate change into a fading memory, not immediately, but perhaps a century from now. So again, the conviction here is not based on naivete, it's based on the fact that we need not to be complacent, we need to adopt environmentally friendly technologies, we need to be engaged in setting very strict standards about carbon emissions, but if we encourage further fertility decline, we will be in a position to buy scientists few decades in which, as I said, human ingenuity perhaps can generate the type of technologies that will turn this climate crisis into a fading memory. Okay. Now, the second part of the book is dealing with the mystery of inequality. Namely, what are the roots of global inequality as we see it today? And as I argued before, if you look at inequality today, much of it was originated at the beginning of the 19th century, at a time where societies took off from stagnation to growth. Now, when you think about proximate causes of uneven development across the globe, it is tempting to say that the differences across societies are based on differences in human capital formation, physical capital formation, and technological level. Namely, that societies that are more advanced are investing more in education, more in physical capital, and more in technologies. This doesn't take us anywhere, because the question is why some societies fail to efficiently invest in physical and human capital, and why some societies fail to adopt advanced technologies. And in order to resolve these issues, we have to ask ourselves, what are the historical and prehistorical barriers in the process of development? Namely, how deep-rooted factors affected this differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth. And when I will refer to deep-rooted factors, I will refer to institutional characteristics and cultural characteristics. And ultimately, I will refer to what I will define as the ultimate factors, namely geography and societal characteristics, as I will define momentarily. So let's start with institutions. Let's think about the fingerprints of institutions in the context of inequality as we see it today. So naturally, if we review the history of the world, we see the emergence of differential institutions across societies. We see that some societies are adopting growth-enhancing, inclusive institutions, democratic institutions, and other societies are adopting growth-retarding, extractive institutions. And naturally, this differential adoption is contributing to the gap that we see across nations. But naturally, when you think about differential institutions across the globe, institutions are not manna from heaven. Typically, they are not appearing out of the blue. They are adapting to the environment in which people are operating. So, yes, there are some instances in human history in which institutions are emerging in some critical junctures, some random junctures in human history. So think, for instance, about the effect of the Black Death. The Black Death is generating scarcity of labor, and as a result of it, it leads into the decline of feudalism here in the UK, and ultimately leads into the emergence of property rights and perhaps to an early industrialization. So the Black Death is naturally a random event that potentially contributed to the emergence of differential institutions across the globe. Or you can think about the Glorious Revolution. Naturally, one can think about a counterfactual history in which, in fact, James II would have defeated William of Orange, okay? The Glorious Revolution would not have occurred, and Britain would have remained an absolute monarchy rather than a constitutional monarchy. So, yes, this is a random event that led into the emergence of constitutional monarchy and arguably into industrialization. Or you can think about perhaps the most striking element, which is the division of Korea along the 38th parallel, that naturally generated a communist hell in the north and perhaps a democratic pseudo-heaven in the south. So this is a random event associated with institution that is generating divergence. But as I said, these are the rare instances in human history that we can count on one hand, and perhaps we will need a few more fingers from the next hand. In most cases, institutions evolve gradually in the course of human history. So when societies move into the Neolithic Revolution, we see an increase in population density, and as a result of it, great demand for institutions that would permit individuals to cooperate in the construction of public goods, that will protect property rights, and will permit certain cohesiveness in the operation of the society. Alternatively, think about the suitability of land for large plantations. Those societies that resided in places where the crops were such that they were suitable for large plantations ultimately generated very large landowners that had a say in the political arena, and as a result of it, we see the implementation of extractive institutions and ultimately even the horrific institution of slavery. Or you can think about the disease environment and its effect on population density and the delayed adoption of centralized institutions. So the bottom line is institutions are of course very important, but to a large extent institutions are byproduct of earlier processes that are triggering the development of one type of institutions over another. So this leads us to step back in human history and to think about the cultural factor. What is the effect of culture on economic development? And this was the case with institutions. Naturally, if we look at human history, at a certain point in human history, we see the emergence of differential cultural traits across regions. Think about it in the context of northern Italy versus southern Italy. So we see growth-enhancing traits such as social capital that are emerging, say, in northern Italy, and we see growth-retarding traits such as family ties that are emerging in the south. And they're leading into a divergence in a place like Italy that has the same political institutions. But again, as I said before, cultural traits are rarely manna from heaven. There are some instances in which random growth-enhancing cultural mutations occurred, and perhaps the most prominent case is coming from Judaism, in which mandatory literacy in the 1st century CE, that was not associated with any economic motivation, led ultimately into the emergence of investment in human capital that persisted because of the ultimate reward to human capital in the urban environments. Or we can think about it in the context of the Protestant Reformation, in which emphasis on thrift and entrepreneurship ultimately prevail, but again, the beginning is not necessarily economically motivated. But as I said, in the context of institutions, culture largely evolved and adapted to the environment in which people operated. When the return to human capital increased, we see a gradual change in the cultural attitude towards child quality, towards education. Environments that are characterized by higher crop yield, crops that are generating a higher return than otherwise, are environments in which farmers are induced to be engaged in planting and harvesting. This is a behavior that requires future-oriented mindset, and as a result of it, future-oriented mindset is evolving in some regions of the world and not in others. In regions in which climatic volatility is very pronounced, we see the emergence of loss aversion, and as a result of it, depression of entrepreneurial spirit. Or in regions in which suitability of land for the use of the plow is very pronounced, we see gender division of labor due to the fact that the plow requires upper body strength, and consequently gender biases that persist to the present. So again, cultural factors are very important, but they are not the prime elements. There is a factor behind them. So this leads us to the shadow of geography, namely how geography affects much of the inequality that we see across the globe. Then you can think about geographical characteristics in the form of soil quality, in the form of climate, the disease environment, or even geographical isolation. And they have an indirect long shadow impact on, as I said, the evolution of cultural and institutional characteristics. In addition, geography has a direct effect on the evolution of societies by depressing labor productivity, by depressing human capital formation, or by depressing trade and technological progress in the context of isolation. But this is not necessarily the long shadow of geography. This is the direct immediate effect of geography. So geography is very important for the understanding of the evolution of culture and the evolution of institutional characteristics. But when we think about geography, and we think about different layers of influence, and in the second part of the book I'm peeling gradually different layers of influence: colonialism, institutions, culture, geography, and now I'm getting into the Neolithic Revolution. As we know, about 12,000 years ago, some societies are marching and are transitioning from hunter-gatherer stage of development into agricultural stage of development. This transition from hunter-gatherer tribes to agricultural communities is associated with the emergence of non-food producing class. This non-food producing class is associated with knowledge creation in the form of science, technology, and written languages, and it generates a technological head start. Namely, those societies that are moving into the Neolithic earlier have a technological edge that persists over time. And according to Jared Diamond in his influential thesis, much of the variations in income per capita across the globe today can be traced to the differential timing of the Neolithic Revolution across the globe. Those societies that move earlier are more prosperous today. Unfortunately, the Diamond hypothesis as it's related to today's world is entirely false, although it is entirely accurate in understanding the past. Namely, variations in the Neolithic Revolution explain variation in income per capita in the Middle Ages fantastically well, but they're entirely mute in understanding income per capita today. And the reason is the following. The Diamond hypothesis is right. The Neolithic Revolution is generating a technological head start. But in addition, it generates comparative advantage in agriculture. And as we move into the modern world, and as we move into a globalized world, specializing in agriculture is a dead end. It has limited externalities, limited spillovers in terms of education, and ultimately this cancels the beneficial effect of the technological head start. As I said, the Diamond hypothesis is very intriguing, but it's not really relevant for the understanding of the world in which we live today. It is very relevant for the understanding of the world up till the year 1500. So, if you remember, when I started my discussion, we started in Africa and we marched forward from Africa to the present. In the second part of the book, I'm taking the step backward, looking at the contemporary world, and I'm moving all the way back to Africa. Why do I move back all the way to Africa? Because it turns out that the exodus of anatomically modern humans from Africa, 60 to 90,000 years ago, had a tremendous impact on the distribution of population diversity across the globe and ultimately comparative development. So let me try to explain the argument very quickly. So during the exodus of modern humans from Africa, as I said, 60 to 90,000 years ago, departing population carried with them only a subset of the diversity that existed in the original population. And why is it so? Well, this is a simple statistical theory. The population in Africa is small. The departing population is small. If you draw from a limited distribution, the draw is not a representative sample. Some of the traits that existed in Africa are being lost in the process. Now, when I'm referring to population diversity, it's a very broad concept. It's cultural diversity, phenotypic diversity, behavioral diversity, and linguistic diversity. And all these processes are affected by this compression. Now, migration is sequential, and consequently, the lower the lower diversity will be found among ancestral population at greater migratory distance from Africa. Let me show it to you here. So if we have an initial population in Africa with a certain degree of diversity, certain diversity in cultural traits, and this population is migrating into the Fertile Crescent, according to this idea that is known as the serial founder effect, the population that will reside in the Fertile Crescent will be less diverse. Some traits will be lost in this migratory process. This population is residing in the Fertile Crescent, expanding up to a point in which the carrying capacity of the environment is no longer sufficient, and they continue to migrate. Some move westward 45,000 years ago into Europe, and again, there is a decline in diversity. Others are moving gradually into the America, crossing the Bering Strait 25,000 years ago, reaching South America 14,000 years ago. And as you can see in this process, the further you are from Africa, the lower is the level of diversity that you will find across the globe. And the evidence is striking. If you look at migratory distance from Africa in 10,000s of kilometers, and you look at diversity, and we can measure it in different ways, the same outcome will emerge, you can see this striking negative relationship, namely the most diverse population in the world is the African population, followed by the European population, the Asian population, the Oceanian population, and Native Americans in the America. Now, why is it so important? It is so important because diversity has conflicting effects on economic development. There are beneficial effects on creativity and innovations, because diversity is associated with cross-fertilization of ideas, complementarities in the production process. But at the same time, there are adverse effects on social cohesiveness. More diverse society tend to suffer from mistrust, and the evidence is striking. More diverse society tend to disagree about the desirable public goods, and consequently, more diverse society tend to be more engaged in conflicts. And this implies that if we have a positive and diminishing effects of diversity on innovations, and positive and diminishing effects of homogeneity on social cohesiveness, then one should expect a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and productivity. And the evidence is striking. You look at the world, this is in the context of urbanization in the year 1500, there is a sweet spot level of diversity. There is an intermediate level of diversity that maximizes productivity. If you look at the world in the year 2000, again, there is a sweet spot level of diversity. But importantly, if you look at the sweet spot level of diversity in the year 1500, it is associated with societies such as China, Korea, and Japan that do not typically appear to us as an optimally diverse. But this is a different period. Technology is not advancing very rapidly, and cultural fluidity is not needed to be prosperous in terms of productivity. It is much more important to be socially cohesive. But as we move to today's world, in fact, the society at the tip of the hump is the United States. Namely, diversity, the sweet spot level of diversity increase in the process of development is expected to continue to increase as we march forward. Now, if you look at all ethnic groups across the globe, 1,265 ethnic groups that are recorded in the demographic atlas, the same pattern will emerge starting from 10,000 BCE to the year 1500. Pronounced hump-shaped relationship. Now, this is not only statistically significant, it is enormously significant from an economic viewpoint, as I will show you momentarily. So let's think about the picture as a whole. We talked before about the wheels of change. Population size, human adaptation, and technological progress. And as I said, they rotated in the course of human history up to a point in which a tipping point was reached, and ultimately the world marched from the Malthusian epoch into the modern growth regime. But naturally, this rotation is not occurring in a vacuum. It is occurring in a context that is partly based on institutions and culture. For instance, if we have institutions that are protecting property rights, technological progress will be faster than otherwise. Okay, so institutions and culture are both affected by technological progress, by the size of the population and the composition of the population, and affecting it at the same level, at the same time. And then we have the initial factors, the ultimate factors, geography and migratory distance from Africa, that again are affecting institutional development, that are affecting cultural factors, and affecting the wheels of change. And as a result of it, some societies are taking off earlier than others because of historical conditions that led into greater rotations of these wheels of change and brought, as I said, takeoff in Europe, that is culturally fluid, for instance, earlier than in China, that is relatively homogeneous culturally. Now, if you ask yourself, what is the magnitude of the effects that we are referring to? It turns out the deep-rooted factors that were determined hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and even tens of thousands of years ago, explain 86% of the variations in income per capita today. And if you think about the different forces that I refer to, the dispersal of humans out of Africa that occurred earlier, explain about 70 to 26% of the variation in income per capita today. Time since human settlement and the Neolithic Revolution is about 3%. It is mostly time since human settlement because, as I told you, the Neolithic Revolution has little explanatory power. Geoclimatic factors, incredible impact, 27 to 38%. The disease ecology, 9 to 14%. Cultural factors, about 20%. And political institutions in the form of executive constraint and polity 4, between 3 and 9%. So what we can see here, that there are many factors. I mean, the view of human history here is rather holistic. There are many factors that are affecting economic development, and we want to resolve inequality, we have to tackle them individually. Now, just before closing, does it imply that history is a fate? Does it imply that, in fact, that one cannot mitigate the legacy of these historical conditions? And the answer is, history is, of course, not a fate. What, in fact, we are learning here, that if we understand our history better, we will be in a better position to design our future. But in a very particular way. We want to develop growth-enhancing policies. These growth-enhancing policies have to be country-specific, history-specific. The World Bank policy of one policy fits all does not apply here. Naturally, each society has particular elements, particular hurdles in their process of development, and one has to mitigate each of these individual hurdles. So this policy will be history-specific, country-specific, geography-specific. One policy does not fit all nations. Let me give you one example before closing. Think about the issue of diversity. If you take societies that are highly diverse, say African societies, that as a result of it suffer greatly from civil conflicts, as we know, then in these particular societies, education is important, but the curriculum is as important. Namely, we have to emphasize, we have to use resources to assure that there is more social cohesiveness, there is more tolerance, there is more respect for difference, there is more respect for other ethnic groups, somehow developing the ability of society to cherish pluralism. But if you take societies in the other end of the spectrum, societies that are very homogeneous, society like Bolivia, for instance, then the challenge there is very different. Education policy in Bolivia will have to generate more diversity than is present at the moment. Namely, educating children how to think outside of the box, allowing children to feel comfortable with challenging the status quo. Namely, developing pluralism in a place where pluralism is absent otherwise. If you think about cultural traits, if in fact we are targeting a particular society that is lacking future-oriented mindset, then again, if it turns out to be the case that the native crops that are relevant for this particular societies were not conducive for agricultural investment, and as a result of it, were not generating future-oriented mindset among these cultural or national populations. And again, more resources should be targeting this particular element in this particular society. This will not be needed in Europe, where in fact native crops were very conducive for agricultural investment and develop great amount of future-oriented mindset. But this can be very relevant for other societies, and again, implies that resources will have to be used very wisely. Now, broadly speaking, when you think about progressive policies, typically some of us wish to adopt progressive policies because of our moral values. Here, the suggestion is that many progressive policies are in fact economically efficient and they hold the key for human prosperity. And this is gender equality and its impact on labor force participation of women and the reduction in fertility, tolerance and its ability to affect the societies that are very diverse in benefiting from cross-fertilization of idea, and generally the virtues of diversity that, according to this study, will increase over time and will become more and more pronounced. So thank you very much.